The Mayor's Tale, a Market Hampden story. There was nothing in the Market Hampden Fire Brigade manual about getting dentists out of trees. If a dentist, or indeed any other person, got stuck up a tree and wanted to come down, that was one thing. There were hoists and extending ladders that could be used, but if he or she didn't want to come down, well, that was another matter altogether. "We shouldn't really be here at all," explained the officer in charge to anyone who cared to listen. "If it was a cat, we'd wait for 3 days before we'd even turn up, in case it came down of its own accord." "It's not a cat, it's my husband," wailed a forlorn and confused Mrs. Stiles, whose spouse was the cause of all the commotion. "I'm sorry," the fire officer apologized with a shrug. "There's nothing more I can suggest. It's a question of resources, manpower and so forth." The fire officer and his men packed their stuff away, climbed up into their big red and yellow tender, and roared out of the Market Square car park. The word spread that they were off to attend a grass fire started by the Grindley children, who kept the fire crew busy most school holidays, there being little else Market Hampden had to offer by way of diversion for the younger generation. Simon Stiles, 48 and balding, Bachelor of Dental Surgery and Fellow in Dental Surgery of the Royal College of Surgeons, England, had been up the tree for 24 hours now. Still wearing his high-necked white dentist's smock, he perched cross-legged on a little platform fashioned out of odd bits of plank, which, his spectators surmised, he had nailed together high up in the branches during the night. Although the weather was warm, it could be seen through binoculars that the dentist had with him a thick anorak, a blue sleeping bag, and a large plastic water carrier, as well as a rucksack, apparently filled with sundry necessaries. He also had with him a child's blackboard, on which, from time to time, he chalked messages, before lowering the board on a long length of string, so that what he had written could be read from below. So far, only requests to be left alone. He hadn't said a thing about his reasons for being up there, and had refused to respond in any way to the puzzled inquiries made via megaphone by the fire brigade and those who knew him, who, through the nature of his work, included most of the town's population. When Mrs. Stiles tried her husband's mobile, it was located ringing in his surgery. A small crowd had gathered in the midsummer sunshine at the foot of the tree, which stood on a patch of grass where the car park met the little shopping precinct in which the town's busy dental practice was situated. No one was quite sure how old the tree was, but it was one of the tallest in the town, with wide, heavy branches and glossy, dark green leaves. "What's he doing now?" asked Carter Swain, the town's short-sighted butcher of the market trader Tricky Tompkins, who had abandoned his deserted snack stall to photograph the scene with his phone. "He's just sitting there looking about," Tricky Tompkins told him. "You missed the best bit. He ate an apple a while ago. I reckon on how he's planning to stay up there." Tricky Tompkins showed the butcher a photograph he had taken of Simon Stiles eating an apple. Carter Swain and others in the crowd craned forwards to see. The dentist's teeth looked brilliantly white. "Couldn't we shoot him with a tranquilizer gun or something?" an exasperated Mayor Hodges muttered in an undertone to the town's senior police officer. This was not turning out to be a good start to the day. First, his wife had given him yet more grief about the holiday she wanted in Mallorca, which he simply couldn't afford, and now this. Inspector Grayling, a tall man who didn't get on with the stout little mayor at the best of times, and had been heard to refer to him as a jumped-up paper boy, sucked in his breath and squinted up at the man at the top of the tree. He took his time before lowering his gaze and shaking his head. "He must be 90 feet up. The fall would kill him." Inspector Grayling shook his head again. "We can't get him down by force, that's plain. In any case, I'm not even sure he's doing anything against the law, except causing a disturbance, possibly. Might get him for being a public nuisance." "He's certainly that," the mayor growled. "The man should be certified." That wouldn't get him out of the tree, the policeman pointed out. We might want to have a talk with him when he finally does come down. In the meantime, there's not much we can do." Mrs. Stiles, who had overheard the last part of this exchange, sobbed into a tiny pink-edged handkerchief. She was a pale, fragile-looking woman with a hunted expression, rather pretty in a distressed way, and anxious for reassurance. She had called the police the previous evening when her husband didn't come home from work, but it hadn't been until mid-morning that he had been spotted at a dizzying height up the tree, and plans to drag the river for his body, to the disappointment of many, had been called off. She dabbed at her eyes and fixed her pleading gaze upon Inspector Grayling, who shuffled and confined himself to a wordless grimace. Mayor Hodges elbowed the man aside and took the woman's hand in his fleshy paw. "Mrs. Stiles," he began in an unnecessarily loud voice, "are you quite sure you have no idea why your husband has done this?" Mrs. Stiles shook her head. "I really couldn't tell you," she told him between sobs. "Simon's never done anything like this before. He's a quiet sort of man usually, hardly ever gets upset." Inspector Grayling leaned confidentially towards the mayor. "It's always the quiet ones, murderers, psychopaths." The mayor ignored the interruption. "Does he have financial problems, perhaps?" Mrs. Stiles shook her head, her hand limp in the mayor's fist. No, I don't think so." "What about his work? Any problems there?" Mrs. Stiles hesitated for a moment. "Not problems, no, only—" The mayor's eyes narrowed. "What?" "It's just, I don't think he likes being a dentist," Mrs. Stiles mumbled, her eyes clouding with tears again. "He told me he hated dentists when he was a child. You know how children are. And somehow I think he feels, although he's never actually said it, that he has become the one thing he has always hated. Does that make sense?" The mayor nodded, though none of it made much sense to him at all. Of course," he sighed. "You mustn't worry yourself. I'm sure it'll all work out in the end." He released the woman's hand and turned back to the inspector, lowering his voice once more to a discreet murmur. "Have you spoken to his work colleagues?" "Naturally. He saw his last patient early yesterday afternoon, a small boy. He was scared of dentists and caused quite a scene, I'm told." The two men transferred their attention once more to the top of the tree, where Simon Stiles sat on his platform, half hidden by foliage. "Is there nothing you can suggest? Nothing at all?" demanded the mayor. "I'll have our community police chaps keep an eye on him," Inspector Grayling conceded with an air of reluctance. "My regular officers have more important things to do. He'll have to come down eventually, when he runs out of food or needs a toilet break." "But how long will that be?" demanded Jeremy Preedy, one of the town's estate agents, from behind the mayor's shoulder. "I've got a business to run. How can I persuade people to move here with all this going on? The last thing we want is a reputation for lunatics." "Exactly," said Mayor Hodges. "There's the good name of the town to think of. Times are hard enough as it is." The inspector smirked. "Gone a bit slow, has it, the paper trade?" The mayor's cheeks flushed and his eyes glittered with silent malice. "We can't all sit on our arses waiting to be paid by the government for doing nothing." Inspector Grayling shivered with hatred, but managed to bite his tongue. "It won't last long. A couple of days at most, unless if it rains. He can't have much in that rucksack. If we make sure no one gets any food or water to him, he'll soon come down." The mayor scowled. "Is that all you have to suggest? Wait until he comes down? A lot of good, that is. Not that I expected anything better." The inspector bristled and drew himself up to his impressive full height. "The gentleman in the tree seems happy enough to me, and as I'm not convinced he's breaking any law, up the tree he may remain." Inspector Grayling wished the mayor a curt good day and stalked back in the direction of the police station. Hardly had he gone than his place in the crowd was taken by the youthful Rector Golightly. "I got your message," the rector told the mayor as he caught his breath, "though I don't quite understand how I can help." The mayor took the slightly built rector by the elbow and led him a couple of paces away from the crowd. "I want you to talk to him, sympathetically." The rector took off his spectacles and wiped them on his sleeve. Well, of course, but he's not one of my regular congregation. I barely know the man. Just talk to him. Try to win his confidence. He may respond to the intimate approach. He won't listen to the fire brigade or the police, not even to his wife. Very well, but how? I can't very well speak to him intimately over a megaphone. You will have to go up to him. The rector started visibly, then replaced his spectacles and goggled at the immensity of the tree before them. Up there? I'm not sure if I— Come along, rector. If he managed it, so can you. You're years younger than he is. Even so. Besides, it's your Christian duty. There are people down here with toothache, loose fillings, diseased gums. They need him. They've got appointments, for heaven's sake. He has to be got safely down so we can all get on with our lives. The rector had no answer to that. Mayor Hodges hustled him through the crowd to the base of the tree, where a ladder had already been placed against the lowest of the tree's mighty limbs. "Are you sure this is the only way?" asked the rector, as his right foot was placed for him on the first rung. "You'll be up there in a jiffy," Mayor Hodges assured him, as he guided the man's left arm onto the ladder. "Easy as falling off a— well, just don't look down." A buzz of excitement went round the crowd, which had grown appreciably in the last few minutes. Rector Golightly ascended the ladder and transferred himself to the lowest of the tree's branches. Several people took photographs as the bespectacled cleric felt his way up through the foliage, clinging to the ivy as his feet, clad in unsuitable plastic leather slip-ons, searched for the next foothold, and then the next. When he was about halfway up the tree, someone in the crowd shouted with sudden enthusiasm, causing the rector to clutch the trunk in startled alarm. "Look! He's seen him!" Several of the crowd pointed upwards towards the top of the tree, where the head of Simon Stiles had appeared, peering down at the approaching clergyman. Rector Golightly, just 20 feet below the renegade dentist, gave an uncertain wave to the man above him, then cupped his hand to his mouth. "Hello!" he yelled. "I've come for a little chat. Is that all right with you?" The dentist gazed down at his visitor for a few seconds, then drew his head back. The rector leaned backwards a little to see where the man had gone, his mouth opening to say something more, something reassuring, no doubt. Simon Stiles reappeared immediately with a black bucket, which he aimed and then upended abruptly, directing a shower of amber liquid down upon the intruder. The crowd gasped with delighted horror as the rector, still gaping, caught the full blast of the stream, which sprayed out in golden droplets after cascading onto his head and shoulders, and then fell in glistening spatters to the ground. The crowd encircling the tree drew back hastily. The smell was rank and unmistakable. It took the rector, spitting and sobbing, less than 20 seconds to scramble back down through the branches to earth. "Look what your husband did to me!" he spluttered at Mrs. Stiles, holding his drenched arms out wide. "I've never been so— look!" The crowd looked, but kept their distance. Mrs. Stiles offered the man her tiny hanky, but the rector refused it with a snarl. Mrs. Stiles retreated with a sob. Mayor Hodges frowned. "At least we know what he's doing for his toilet arrangements." The rector shot the mayor a venomous look and turned on his heel. "Where are you going?" asked the mayor. "Shower," replied Rector Golightly, spitting. "You can't just walk off. What do we do now?" "Pray for him," snapped the rector as he disappeared up the shopping precinct. Carter Swain, the butcher, glanced about in a furtive manner and stepped in close to Mayor Hodges. "I could chop that tree down, me and a couple of the lads, cost you a tenner." "You can't go round chopping trees down whenever you feel like it," said the mayor with a sigh. "It's probably got a preservation order on it or something." "We could do it during the night," said the butcher, leaning closer still. "No one will be any the wiser." The mayor recoiled from the smell of dead meat and blood that hung around Carter Swain, but wondered for a fleeting moment if it could be done. No, you can't. He could be hurt." "Should have thought about that before he went up there, shouldn't he?" said Carter Swain. Mayor Hodges sighed again. It was turning into a long day. The mayor was still there half an hour later when a gaggle of media people arrived. Cameras with big lenses were focused on the man in the tree, and impatient journalists surrounded Mayor Hodges, demanding information. "Is it an ecological protest of some kind?" I don't think so. Is he a nutter? He's a dentist. A dentist? So why is he up there? Your guess is as good as mine. The reporters thought for a moment, then as one turned to stare up at the man in the tree, who in his turn stared down at them, and they began to make their guesses. The mayor, realizing, puffed indignantly. Who are you lot, anyway? I spoke to the girl from the County News this morning. I made it quite plain there's nothing for her here. County News? You're having a laugh, mate. We're the Nationals. Early the following morning, as a queasy dawn broke over the town, a thoughtful Mayor Hodges was already behind the counter in his little newsagent's shop, leafing through the papers. The Times delivered a sober account of events under the headline, Experts Baffled by Dentist's Tree Protest, while The Guardian, a newspaper the mayor never read, offered the headline, Dentist Gives Kick in Teeth to Modern Society, and went on to speculate in a double-column piece that in climbing his tree Simon Styles was giving expression to a national malaise. The Daily Mail opted for Police Time Wasted on Man in Oak, and lamented the failure of the authorities to sort the matter out. The Sun, too, gave the story considerable prominence, dedicating its centre pages to a big photograph of the fugitive in his lofty dwelling under the heading, Out of his dentistry! Mayor Hodges read each article to the end before folding the papers up and placing them back in the rack for sale. This was getting out of hand. But there again, when things got out of hand, there was money to be made. Upon Mrs. Hodges coming into the shop with a lukewarm cup of tea and slapping down yet another travel brochure about the delights of Majorca, he growled at her to bring him his mobile phone. She glared at him and told him she wasn't there to be bossed about by him, and he needn't think she was. None of her friends' husbands were as uncouth and utterly selfish as he was. Why she had married him in the first place she just couldn't think. He could fetch his stupid phone himself if it was so important. The first call he made was to Tricky Tompkins. When the television people arrived in town an hour later, looking for a whimsical story to round off the breakfast news summaries, Mayor Hodges was there before them. Clouds of steam billowed from Tricky Tompkins's red and white striped market stall, and the smell of grilling bacon drifted through the car park. For a moment, the attention of the camera crews and accompanying reporters was distracted from the prospect of the lunatic in the tree. "Good morning, everyone!" Mayor Hodges yelled above the sound of the generator and varied murmurs of suspicion and surprise. "Good morning to you all, and welcome to Market Hampden, the lily of the South East Midlands. On behalf of the town, I would like to offer you, our esteemed visitors, tea and bacon rolls, and croissants for the ladies." He waved a pudgy hand towards the stall. "Please help yourselves." Reporters and cameramen alike grinned and pressed around the little stall. £2 for tea or coffee, £3.50 for a bacon butty, Tricky Tompkins informed them in his most helpful and persuasive market trader's voice. Half an hour later, as the press set up their cameras and the reporters rehearsed their pieces, Tricky Tompkins sidled up to Mayor Hodges. "We're making a bleeding killing here, effing townies. We could double the prices and they'd hardly notice. How long do you think we can keep this going?" They repeated the operation at coffee time in the middle of the morning, at lunchtime, at tea time, and again in the evening. The smell of burgers and chips, sausages and onion, bacon and coffee pervaded the whole of the car park and drifted up the little shopping arcade. If it hadn't been for the exorbitant prices, even Mayor Hodges would have bought something. Just as the light was failing and the by now usual crowd of onlookers was beginning to thin, the attention of the press pack was engaged by movement at the top of the tree. The child's blackboard, with something scrawled upon it in white chalk, descended at the end of its long string. The mayor grabbed it before anyone else could read what it said. "Feed me," he read in a low voice. He glanced up as a cameraman bore down on him, levelling a hungry lens in his direction, and hastily scrubbed the board clear. "Nothing of interest," said the mayor in a cheery tone. "Just joining me in welcoming you all here." Later that evening, as soon as it was completely dark and the camera crews had retired to the local bars and hotels, Mayor Hodges and Tricky Tompkins tied a small basket to the string that still dangled from the top of the tree and tugged on it twice. The basket began to move upwards, emitting the aroma of freshly cooked savouries as it ascended. "Same again tomorrow evening, and every evening as long as he wants, right?" the mayor whispered urgently to his confederate. "But not a word to anyone. We could be on to a good thing here." Tricky Tompkins tapped the side of his nose. "Leave it to me." Early next morning, Mayor Hodges felt a warm glow steal over him as he flicked through the papers. The newspaper editors had decided as one to see in Simon Styles a prophet of all that was wrong in the life of the nation. In climbing his tree, they explained, Simon Styles had expressed the secret angst of the middle classes at the moral decay so obvious in contemporary society. Depending upon which paper was consulted, he was voicing his condemnation of cuts in public services, throwing light upon the growing divide between the government and the common people, or signalling rebellion against the sacrifices that he, like everyone else in the country, was being asked to make at this difficult time. He was celebrated in the leader columns for his courage in standing up and rejecting all the things that everyone else contented themselves with merely resenting. The crowd that gathered around the tree that morning was several times as large as that of the day before. Film crews had arrived from all over Europe, and Mayor Hodges detected accents from far beyond the immediate continent, America, South Africa, Australia. Mrs. Tompkins and her sons had to be drafted in to help Tricky Tompkins keep up with the demand for food and drink. The wide pocket at the front of his apron bulged with cash. "Yes, mate, what would you like?" £5 for a bacon butty? They were £3.50 yesterday." "Supply and demand, mate, supply and demand. Nothing I can do about it." At the height of the lunchtime rush, there were hundreds of people in the car park, and it took half an hour to reach the head of the queue for refreshments. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Grayling was at his wits' end, trying to marshal the crowd and to cope with the requirements of the television crews. "I don't understand it," he confided. "I was sure he'd have given it up by now. How's he managing without food or water?" The mayor sniffed. "Don't ask me." "Do something," the inspector demanded. "I've had to close the car park to traffic. People are leaving their cars on pavements all through the town. It's chaos." "Get more traffic wardens," Mayor Hodges offered with an unsympathetic shrug of the shoulders. Then he turned his back on the policeman and headed back to his shop. There were matters to arrange. Mallorca was becoming a distinct possibility. Late that night, when no one was watching, another basket ascended the tree, this time loaded with chicken and chips, ice cream, and a flask of coffee. The fifth day of the sensation brought with it more than one small but significant development. As the media crews gathered around their vans and contemplated another day of extended speculation, they were surprised to find 3 more tented stalls had sprung up alongside Tricky Tompkins's refreshment point. Visitors to the car park could now avail themselves of the opportunity to buy souvenirs of their unique experience. These ranged from pamphlets on the town's history and placemats showing local scenes to tea towels adorned with recent headlines from the press, mugs decorated with Tricky Tompkins's photographs of the dentist in his tree, and T-shirts bearing cartoons of Simon Styles on his lofty perch, complete with such slogans as "Tree Fella" and "Market Hampton, a tremendous place." There were even little clay models of the dentist, painstakingly depicted with medical smock and rucksack. The media weren't interested, but plenty of other visitors were, and Mrs. Hodges and her 2 widowed sisters were kept busy at the tills. Mrs. Hodges hadn't wanted to help until her husband had drawn a link between the profits to be made and the possibility of tickets to Mallorca. At this she had huffed and puffed for a good 10 minutes, accusing him of all sorts, before she had grudgingly agreed to come along. Mayor Hodges surveyed the crowds milling around the stalls with satisfaction. As well as setting up the new stalls, it had also turned out to have been a good idea to organise the row of portable toilets that now stood at the far end of the car park. They were the sort that remained locked until someone put a coin in the lock to gain entrance. When 2 coachloads of pensioners arrived at the entrance to the car park, bladders full after their long drive, his joy knew no bounds. Mallorca, he promised himself, beckoned. Mrs. Stiles, jostled and forlorn, was there most of the time, just as she had been every day so far, casting her tear-filled, blue-eyed gaze up towards the top of the tree. When someone bumped into her and nearly knocked her over, Mayor Hodges hurried over and led her to a safer spot. "Don't worry about your husband, Mrs. Stiles," the mayor assured her. "I'm sure he'll come down soon." "Do you really think so? Really?" Mayor Hodges took her hand in his. He liked holding her hand. "He can't stay up there forever, you know." Mrs. Stiles nodded and sniffed. "I suppose you're right. Thank you. I'm so grateful," she said. "You're the only one who's shown me the slightest kindness in all this. Thank you so much." "Not at all, Mrs. Stiles." "Call me Patricia, please." "Patricia." The mayor gave her hand a squeeze, and then let it go before his wife spotted him. Public interest in the affair showed no sign of slackening off by the end of the first week. The media came and went in response to the demands of rival stories, but the flood of other visitors to the town continued unabated. The sun shone, the coaches arrived, the cash poured in, and Simon Stiles remained as uncommunicative as ever at the top of his tree. Mayor Hodges couldn't have been happier, especially with Inspector Grayling looking so aggrieved at the disruption, and Mrs. Stiles seeking out the protection of his shielding arm whenever the situation threatened to overwhelm her. If only Mrs. Hodges would leave off pestering him about ordering the tickets for her holiday, it would be perfect. The car park had assumed something of a holiday atmosphere, what with the sense of occasion, the souvenir stalls, the food and drink, and the arrival of a group of buskers supplied by Market Hampden's enthusiastic acoustic club. A local choir took advantage of the assemblage to sing a selection of songs from hit musicals, and there was even a juggler and a fire-eater. Some visitors brought folding chairs with them so they could savour the scene in comfort. In breaks between sets from the musicians, the visitors pursued pleasant and inventive speculation about the reasons for Simon Stiles making such a spectacle of himself in the first place. The prevailing opinion, feeding on the articles in the press, was that he was indeed making a public statement, rejecting the conventions and limitations of modern society, although whether this was in favour of greater licence and liberty, or in support of a return to the ideals of an earlier age, depended more upon the inclinations of those discussing the issue than upon the real or fancied notions of the protester himself. Simon Stiles himself remained remote and unsharing, requesting nothing more than an extra blanket and some toilet roll. From time to time his head could be seen peering over the edge of his platform, inspecting the changing view below, but he did not respond to the questions and taunts of the crowd. Eventually most of the spectators gave up shouting and simply returned the man's gaze, each side eyeing the other and keeping their thoughts to themselves. There was some excitement when the chief constable, a stern-looking but not unattractive brunette in a spotless uniform, turned up to check that everything was under control. Inspector Grayling buzzed about his superior with a mixed air of anxiety and self-importance, clearing her way to a good vantage point and detailing the steps he had already taken for public safety. It was the first time the chief constable had visited the town since her promotion. When the mayor ventured to introduce himself, Inspector Grayling drowned his greeting in a loud coughing fit and then ushered his superior aside. The chief constable expressed guarded satisfaction with the measures the inspector had taken, and even suggested that he come along and speak to a meeting of her officers on the peculiar challenges of policing such an event. Inspector Grayling blushed and said he would be delighted to. The chief constable then went so far as to allow herself to be photographed, while she and Inspector Grayling tossed some bits of sausage roll to the ducks and swans on the river. On the following day, the local Member of Parliament arrived. He gave the man up the tree a cursory look and a cheery wave, then delivered a speech to the cameras in which he interpreted the dentist's protest as proof that the population as a whole was getting mightily fed up with the government's current stance on national health policy. He said nothing that might help get Simon Styles down. Then he shook a few hands and drove back to Westminster in a purring Jaguar. The mayor, who saw the great man off with a hearty slap on the back, thought the car very beautiful, and wondered if he might extend his ambition beyond the town's cramped council chamber and run for Parliament himself one day. But he knew in his heart that his wife would never stand for it. A couple of days into the second week of the sensation, the town awoke to the news that a solicitor in Redditch had ascended a tree in the town centre to protest against local planning restrictions. Within 24 hours, the news broke that a bus driver from Swindon had taken similar action, as had an unemployed builder in Stoke-on-Trent, both for unspecified reasons. By the end of the week, there were more than a dozen such arboreal protests taking place around the country. These copycat protests caused outrage in the pubs and shops of Market Hampden. These were cheap imitators trying to get in on the act, while their man was the original and best, the only authentic tree protester worth taking notice of. Nonetheless, the proliferation of such protests quickly blunted press interest and dented the story's newsworthiness. Matters were further compromised when a woman who had climbed a horse chestnut in Hounslow in order to voice her feelings about cruelty to Spanish donkeys fell out of her tree and was seriously injured. The newspapers, which had initially done so much to promote the whole thing, became critical of the phenomena. The actions of such protesters were childish and irresponsible, and it was no surprise to them that it was all ending in tears. The police really ought to do something about it. Interest in Simon Styles began to fade. The crowd in Market Hampden car park slowly dwindled, although there was still enough trade to make it worthwhile keeping the stalls open for several more weeks. Summer ended abruptly a week into September. After a day of unlikely heat and troubled wind, the evening sky darkened with unusual speed, and during the night the town was lashed by a ferocious early autumn storm. Heavy rain emptied the streets, and the dentist was left alone in his eyrie. When morning came, quiet and dripping, it was evident that something drastic had happened in the car park. The tree that had been Simon Styles's home for some 6 weeks lay in an untidy jumble across the open space. Shattered boughs and clumps of foliage littered the whole area. The fire brigade were called and used their lifting equipment to clear the larger pieces of debris. Of Simon Styles they found only his platform, his sleeping bag, his child's blackboard, and his bucket. Of the dentist himself and of his rucksack there was no sign. Speculation about the dentist's disappearance was intense for days following. Some thought the tree must have been hit by lightning during the storm. Others cast suspicious glances towards Carter Swain, or argued that the government, fearing the political ramifications of the protest, must have finally lost patience and had ordered special forces to spirit Simon Styles away in a helicopter under the cover of the storm. Another theory implicated the Royal College of Surgeons, England, alleging that they had taken steps to rescue one of their own. Sally Thripp, the dance teacher whose belly dancers had been planning to perform in the car park that day, stated her belief that the dentist had been carried off in a mystic helicopter piloted by angels and that he would never be seen again. Some people, like Mayor Hodges, expressed disappointment at the loss of Market Hampden's prime attraction. Privately, though, he was also relieved that the fuss might at last die down. In this he was quickly proved correct. After a last visit from the press and a trickle of spectators to inspect and photograph the ruined tree, the car park emptied, and, once the tree had been cleared away and the stalls dismantled, was reopened to traffic, to the substantial relief of Inspector Grayling. Within a month of the tree coming down, only the occasional visitor turned up in town to inspect the scene of the summer's events. They invariably left disappointed, quickly exhausting their curiosity on the stump of the celebrated tree. In an attempt to prolong interest, unidentified locals set up a little shrine on the stump, complete with flowers in a small bucket and a couple of Tricky Tompkins's photos in cheap frames. People eventually tired of discussing what the dentist's motivation might have been. Life in Market Hampden went on in its sweet, lazy, subterranean way. Similar arboreal protests elsewhere petered out under the constraints of the autumn climate, especially after they were taken up as a form of fund-raising charity stunt, which only debased the currency of such demonstrations. It was agreed by the townsfolk that, on the whole, the experience had proved a positive one to most of those whose lives had been caught up in it. The media had got a good story. Inspector Grayling had won the approval of his superior. Tricky Tompkins had done nicely from his share of the profits from the refreshments and bought himself a new mobile phone with a better camera facility. Even the rector, who had issued forthright attacks from his pulpit against Simon Styles and his protest, gained himself a reputation as something of a firebrand, rather to his own surprise. A young female dentist, meanwhile, inherited Simon Styles's place at the practice in the shopping precinct. The men of the town began to look forward to their next dental appointment, when they would be able to lie back and gaze into the bespectacled eyes of a beautiful blonde while having their teeth seen to. The practice itself was never busier. When Mayor Hodges totted up the takings from the stalls he had set up, he was agreeably surprised at the total. There was more than enough to buy those tickets that his wife continued to badger him for, now with redoubled frequency. Sighing, he went online and found the ticket application page. He selected the dates, filled in his address and credit card details, and was about to type out the names of those travelling when he was interrupted by his wife yelling at him from upstairs. If he didn't pull his finger out and get those tickets for Mallorca, he was informed, she'd pack a suitcase that very night and take herself off to her sister's. Just see if she didn't. Her mother had always warned her against marrying a selfish man. How she wished she had listened. God only knew he'd never shown her the slightest consideration or kindness. The mayor's brow furrowed, and for a long, long time his pudgy fingers remained poised in mid-air. Then, slowly and deliberately, his fingers descended on the keys, and he typed out first his name, and then that of Mrs. Patricia Styles. Yes, just about everyone, it seemed, had got something out of the affair. It would be an exaggeration to say that the town itself was changed in any lasting way. After all was said and done, at the level inhabited by ordinary people, it takes more than acts of single individuals, however deranged or extreme, to change the world. A lot more. But such is the nature of history. The affair was not entirely forgotten, however. Instead, it entered the folklore of the town. Local people took to referring to people who behaved irrationally or took themselves off unexpectedly as doing a dentist, while drinkers in the Flower of England and other local pubs excused themselves on visits to the gents by explaining that they were just going for a rector's breakfast. As for the man who had caused it all, it was not until many months later that more was heard of the notorious Simon Styles. But that's quite another story.